Alright, hello everybody. This is going to be the start of what God's grace will be a very rewarding time for me spiritually as a pastor, and hopefully we'll give you some insight into some different things you may or may not have thought about, or may give you a different angle. First, I just want to start off by saying I'm Pastor Josh Dubois. If you'll notice in the camera view, you don't see me. You're seeing what we need to focus on. That's how it's going to be through these mini sermons or sermonettes. What I'm going to talk to you today about is George Muller. I'm going to read you the story of George Muller. This comes from Christianity.com. The children are dressed and ready for school, but there is no food for them to eat, the house mother of the orphanage informed George Muller. George asked her to take the 300 children into the dining room and have them sit at the tables. He thanked God for the food and waited. George knew God would provide food for the children, as he always did. Within minutes, a baker knocked on the door. "Mr. Muller," he said, "last night I could not sleep. Somehow I knew that you would need bread this morning. I got up and baked 3 batches for you. I will bring it in." Soon there was another knock at the door. It was the milkman. His cart had broken down in front of the orphanage. The milk would spoil by the time the wheel was fixed. He asked George if he could use some free milk. George smiled as the milkman brought in 10 large cans of milk. It was just enough for the 300 thirsty children. The boy was a thief. George Muller was not always a person of such great faith and good character. As a young boy, growing up in Germany in the early 1800s, he often stole money from his dad. As a teenager, he sneaked out of the hotel twice without paying for the room. One time he was caught by police and put in jail. As a Bible college student, George loved going to bars, drinking, gambling, and being the life of the party. He also loved making fun of people, especially Christians. Surprised by a Bible study, one day a friend invited George to go off to an off-campus Bible study. He went only because he wanted to make fun of the Christians later. But to his surprise, he liked the Bible study. For the first time, he saw the people who really knew and loved God. He attended each evening. Before the end of the week, he knelt at his bed and asked God to forgive his sins. George's friends saw a change in him immediately. He no longer went to bars or made fun of people. He spent more time reading his Bible, talking about God, and going to church. Soon he found that his friends did not want him to be around him anymore. When George told his father that he had decided to become a missionary, his father became very upset. He wanted George to have a high-paying job and not to be a poor missionary. He told George that he would not give him any more money for school. George knew he had to do what God was calling him to do, even if his dad didn't support him. An hour after he prayed, the answer came. George went back to college without knowing how he was going to pay for his tuition. He did something he thought was a bit silly for a grown man to do. He got on his knees and asked God to provide. To his surprise, an hour later, a professor knocked on his door. He offered George a paid tutoring job. George was amazed. This was the beginning of George Muller's dependence on God. Almost dying to turn out for the best. After finishing college, George was ready to begin his missionary work in London, England. But there was one problem. Germany required all healthy men to serve at least 1 year in the army. George wanted to get his mission as quickly as possible. However, he became very sick. His illness was so severe that he almost died. It also made him unable to serve in the army. He was now free to go to England as a missionary. No more rich seat, poor seat. George became the pastor of a small church in England. Church wanted to pay him a good salary from the money it received renting pews to rich church members who sat at the front of the church. Poor members had to sit in the cheap seats in the back. George told them that this had to stop if they wanted him to be their pastor. Even so, he did not allow the church to pay him a salary. He trusted God to meet his needs, and God did. George and his family never missed a meal and were always able to pay their rent. George began to sense, however, that God had something else for him to do. Praying food into the home. Each day as George walked the streets, he saw children everywhere who had no mom or dad. They lived on the streets or in state-run poorhouses, where they were treated badly. George felt God calling him to open an orphanage to take care of the children. George prayed, asking God to provide a building, people to oversee it, furniture, and money for food and clothing. God answered his prayers. The needs of the orphanage were met each day. Sometimes a wealthy person would send a large amount of money, or a child would give a small amount, received as a gift or for doing chores. Many times food, supplies, or money came at the last minute, but God always provided without George telling anyone about his needs. He just prayed and waited on God. More than 10,000 children lived in the orphanage over the years. When each child became old enough to live on his own, George would pray with him and put a Bible in his right hand and a coin in his left. He explained to the young person that if he held on what was in his right hand, God would always make sure that there was something in his left hand as well. It has been more than 165 years since George Muller took in his first orphan. His vision continues today as Christians around the world are inspired by his faith to depend on God to meet their needs and the needs of helpless children. You can see the story of George Muller's life in a video called The Obstacle to Comfort. The reason I'm sharing that story with you tonight is because I believe that God has called all of us. But more than that, I believe that God, as he said so many times in Scripture, if you even look at all, he says, just rely on me. I'll provide what you need. How often do you do that? How often do you say, I rely on the one that was nailed to the cross that you're looking at right now? I don't rely on what I can do or what I think I can do. Because without him, all of it's not possible. But with God, all things are possible. So I'm going to say it again. Are you relying on God? Or are you relying on yourself? If you're relying on yourself, don't be fooled, because one day you won't be able to even rely on yourself. And that time may be now. But if you rely on the God that created us, you'll never have anything to worry about. Second thing I want to ask you is, if God told you to sell everything that you owned and move to the inner city, foreign land, or do anything that would totally change your life or make you uncomfortable, are you willing to do it? And do it with a good attitude? And do it in a way that's honoring to our God, that's in his only Son to die for you and me? If you're willing to do that, God will honor you. How much of a follower are you? Are you are you a fan or are you a follower? Now those particular words come from an author that wrote a book called Not a Fan. And I can't remember his name at the moment, but whenever I can look it up, I'll go ahead and, give me one sec here, I'll be able to tell you. Okay, not a fan. Not a Fan is by Kyle Idleman. Okay. In that book, he talks about being a fan or being a follower. If you're a fan, you get the bumper stickers, which many of us do. You have the clothing that has the cross and Jesus on it, and so many things. That's being a fan. Just like a football fan, you got the same thing. They say a team instead of God or Jesus, but you're still a fan. Jesus said in the scriptures, if you're my followers, you'll do what I ask you to do, and you'll keep my commandments. And then he said, do you love me? How much do you love me? No, really, do you love me? If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. So again, I ask you, are you a fan or are you a follower? If you're a follower, what is God asking you to do? I want you to think about that. Think about what he's asking you to do. Does it mean, if it means not hanging out with the same people you've been hanging out with, people that really don't care about you, just want to have fun with you or be around you and do what they're doing? Or are you a follower? Are you taking up your cross daily and following God? I gotta tell you, it's not easy. There's times when people will say things to you that say they're your friends, but they'll say bad things about you because you're following God. If that's the case, they're not your friends. People that are your friends will be your friends no matter what you're doing, unless it's hurting you or the people around you. But again, what are you doing that God has asked you to do? Are you being a fan or are you being a follower? Or are you doing as George Mullin did and living your life totally by faith, praying for everything that you need and leaving the rest up to God? That's what being a follower is. My prayer for you as I close is that God will give you the power, His power will give you the desire and the want and the never-ending thirst to follow and serve Him, to have such a desire to see souls saved for Christ, to have such a desire that no matter what, you'll follow Him. In closing, I just want to say, would you give up your child to save the world from their sins and their damnation and their everything that they do that's bad? Would you give up your child? He did that for you. I hope that you will at least consider some of the things I've gone over, and I hope that it brings a blessing to you. I wish you the best, and God bless.